The feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle story to appear in all four Gospels, or one of the only ones. And in matter of fact, Matthew and Mark seem to like it so much that they repeat it in a different form. They talk about another feeding of 3,000. Now, whether this is the same event or another event, you sit there and say, shouldn't the disciples, if a second event like this happened, known what Jesus was going to do? But, they were pretty dense. They did not catch on what Jesus was trying to tell them. So it's entirely possible that it was repeated in a number of different ways, and the disciples didn't catch on as quick as they should. But the fact that each of the Gospels talks about this and that it's repeated over is pointing out the fact that the gospel message carries with it a sense of compassion and care and love and sharing with other people. In fact, this is goes along much with what we read in the first epistle of John, which reads, "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Those who say, 'I love God,' and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from Christ is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also." That's taken from the 4th chapter of 1 John. For me, this miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 teaches that there are 3 ingredients to true care. The first is a basic feeling of compassion for others. And note the story context. John the Baptist has just been beheaded. It's obvious that the leaders of the Jews do not like anything upsetting the apple cart. And people know this, and yet they are flocking to hear what Jesus has to say. Jesus is a little bit brokenhearted. Because he has heard of what has happened to John, he and the disciples get on the boat. They're weary from ministry in one town after another. They go out into the sea, and they're heading over to a quiet place where they can get a rest. And yet the crowd gets an idea of where they're going to be, and they are greeted there by a huge crowd. And after healing and ministering to them for that day, the disciples, who are bone weary, say to Jesus, "This is a deserted place. We can't care for them. Send them to go into the villages far off so they can find something to eat." And Jesus flips that around and says, "No, you feed them." What do we have? They scrounge around, they find a boy, at least one of the texts says a young boy, has a small lunch of a number of loaves of bread and a number of fish. And they say, "But what is that in this situation?" And Jesus says, "Bring it to me." And a miracle occurs. He takes those gifts, and somehow everybody is fed, with an abundance over of 12 baskets full after he's done. Talk about an amazing miracle. But take a look at the fact that it starts with tired, worn out, beaten, fatigued disciples who say, "What in the world can we do?" A very interesting article called "The Heartless Lovers of Humankind," written by Paul Johnson, was published a number of years ago in the Wall Street Journal. And one of the things that he says in that particular article is that many good people who are well-meaning, who have all kinds of theoretical ideas for dealing with the problems of the world, have really messed things up. And part of the problem is that loving humanity as an idea, they often come up with solutions that don't really talk about individual need, that don't deal with individual people. They come up with ideas that are theoretical, that should work, but they don't know what it's like to be the person involved. They come up with all kinds of ideas, but they really don't work. And he uses as an example the fact that many times people pray and pray and pray, and unfortunately when their prayers are answered, it comes in a form very different than what they want to accept. They pray for people to come into church, and then they're the wrong kinds of people. They are the wrong color, the wrong ethnic group, the wrong language group. The fact is that a lot of times Christians are well-meaning, but they don't really minister in an effective way. Very often churches will send kids off on mission trips that does something, but when they leave behind or leave the place where they're ministering, they really haven't accomplished a whole lot. Whereas something as we're trying to do with the shoebox Christmas gifts, the Project Christmas Child, is working through local missionaries who have ongoing contact with the people, and they are able to build on the gifts of compassion because they know what's needed in that particular area. And the same thing is true of local ministries. If you're ministering through local ministries, pick out those who really are doing something and can follow through and build on it. Johnson points out how crazy we often are because, of course, sometimes the people that God gives us come sort of messy. Humanity is messy. One of the things that Paul Johnson points out is that Karl Marx was one of those people who had great theories, but there was problems in his own life. For one, he wanted to talk about how to minister to the masses. And much of his communist type of thinking may have been well meant, but the fact is he didn't know how to do it himself. He points out the fact that Marx inherited considerable sums of money, which he never gave away. He never had less than 2 servants. He had a horror of what he called a purely proletarian setup. He made his wife send out greeting and visitation cards that had it listed "Nee Baroness Westerfellen," meaning he was sort of name dropping. He never allowed his daughters to be trained at anything or even go to school except to learn how to play the piano. He figured that they would make better wives if they knew how to play the piano. He also liked to be entertained by them. He seduced his wife's servant, begat a son by her, and then forced his associate, Frederick Engels, to assume paternity. He never made a visit to an actual factory. So many of his ideas on how to help people couldn't attach to any reality. Contrast that with the basic Christian belief that God so wanted to identify with common people that he sent his son Jesus in the flesh to live among us and to know what it is to live in human flesh. John 1, the first chapter here begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And then verse 14 says, "And the Word became flesh and lived among us." And one can only wonder whether the social, economic, and moral collapse of the idolatry that we call communism fell apart partly simply because it wasn't attached to any real reality. And we as Christians also have to make sure that what we are attempting to do is attached to reality. That we know what's going on in the world. We know the needs of individuals. So the very first thing we see is to have Jesus' kind of compassion is to really respect the value of and to meet the needs of real people. There was a story in a local newspaper that recounted a vandalism that occurred at a school. The person who did it was caught and sent to trial, and 3 people were called to be witnesses. The irony was that as they were called, this is the way they were called. The prosecuting attorney said, "Please send in Mr. Ferricci, who is the principal," and so he was brought in. Next, he called Mr. Lombardi, the vice principal, to come in. And then as they called as the next witness, they said, "Send in the janitor." Didn't even name him. Now, he did get named as he was called and sworn in. But the fact is, the irony was in pushing the principal and the assistant principal as witnesses, they sort of defeated their purpose because the only eyewitness to the event was the janitor. They spent little time talking to him, the actual eyewitness, and they talked so much to the principal and the vice principal, who were only talking theoretically. It was no wonder that the person was acquitted. They didn't know the audience, and they didn't know the needs. In a book called Nobody Knows My Name by James Baldwin, people were made aware of the black experience of life and brought it into consciousness, and it led to the beginnings of the civil rights movement. Because people saw in print something what it was like to be black. The French philosopher and theologian Desjardins brought together human relations and the idea of religion and ethics and theology when he said, "The way you treat people is the way you treat God." The story of the feeding of the 5,000 begins when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them. Second ingredient of true care that I find in the miracle story is personal sharing. Jesus said, they need not go away. You give them something. And of course, the only thing they have to give is a little lunch that a boy has who's in the crowd. But what is that? And Jesus takes it, and he makes much out of it. And the irony is, Jesus has this way of calling people to give their very best. He demands a lot of them. He doesn't settle for second best. To the rich young ruler, he said, "Sell all that you own and distribute it to the poor." And of course, the man didn't do that. And then to the short of stature tax collector Zacchaeus, evidently his conversation was to talk about maybe how he had cheated people, how he needed to change his life situation. And Zacchaeus, after meeting Jesus, declares that he will give back all the goods that he had cheated people out of, and he will repay fourfold to the poor. Aside from the typical Hebrew hyperbole that often occurs here, one point in the feeding of the 5,000 story is never underestimate what your personal deed of compassion may do in the lives of others. And also take note that the compassion, as I said, was leading people into a deeper relationship with God and to Jesus. It was expecting that when you walk with Jesus, lives would be changed. How many times has a simple word of sympathy and encouragement by a friend broken one's spell of loneliness or depression? A phone call has come that cheers somebody up. A meal is brought. A card comes. Whatever it may be, small little gestures often have a tremendous impact on people. Never underestimate the small things that you do, because God can get a hold of them and multiply them just as He multiplied the fish and the bread. Some of the most helpful social developments in recent years are things like hospice and respite movements. Their volunteers show their compassion for those who are dying, those who are suffering from dementia, those who are disabled, and their families, simply by sitting with the patients to provide comfort and also respite for family members. These gifts of time and compassion and presence are loaves and fish that help feed hungry souls with spiritual food that is priceless. First ingredient of true care is a basic feeling of compassion for others. The second is personal sharing. And the third is organized action. Compassion without organized action does not provide the training needed in things like hospice and respite volunteers or systems to make their assignments. Compassion without action that is organized will not deliver gifts from Covenant World Relief or Red Cross or many other organizations that are meant to meet the needs of people who have suffered devastation from hurricanes and floods and other disasters, whether wildfires or whatever. And just as the resources of government and community agencies and churches have to be organized and mobilized to deliver true care where it's needed, Jesus organized this group. The story says that the 5,000 are divided up into groups. Mark specifies groups of 50 and 100. Intimacy occurs when you get up close to people, when you see them face to face, when you hear about the needs of their lives and understand what's going on in their lives. There's a lot more openness to share, a lot more openness to help, a desire to make sure you do things right. Next, he told them to sit down, and sitting down decreases the pushing and the shoving and promotes sharing. And we know this. If you have an event going on and there's the possibility of a giveaway or whatever it might be, you have people seated, or you put them in an organized line, or you have them respond by numbers. Why? Because it keeps down some of the hysteria. It causes people to act in a more appropriate way. They don't just run and rush. Also, when you get to know people, and we might put this around because in one sense this might have been sort of like a potluck, because one commentator said one of the possibilities is that many people indeed had food with them, but they weren't about to bring it out until Jesus brought out the loaves and fish, and then suddenly they begin to share of what they have, and there was plenty more to go. But you sit down in these small groups, you get to know people, and one of the things I've noticed with church potlucks is that very often, if you don't know the people around it, there's a temptation to heap food onto your plate, maybe far more than you're going to eat. One of the problems we saw at our angel tree dinners was sometimes it seemed like so much of the food that we were serving got heaped up on plates that then got thrown away. But when people are aware of who they're dealing with and the needs, they tend to share more readily. But perhaps the main teaching is that even for Jesus, a large problem had to be reduced to solvable proportions through prudent management and organization. One of Charles Schultz's early cartoons from Peanuts shows Linus watching a TV, and his sister Lucy comes in and says, "I want to watch my show." And Linus says, "Well, why do you get to pick the show?" And she says, "Because my 5 fingers, when I curl them up like this, become a very powerful instrument." And Linus says, "What channel do you want to watch?" And then in the last panel, he looks at his fingers and he says, "Why can't you guys get organized like that?" The miracle happens, and we'll never know for certain. As I said, sometimes you wonder if it was sort of like a potluck. People began to share. It's very possible, not beyond God at all, that Jesus somehow made the loaves and fish multiply in a way that totally is in God's hands. We've got to give room for that as well. The fact is, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is that Christians are called to minister, even when we're tired and worn out and broken. Our little gifts, our little things that we do might be used by God to change lives. Indeed, the Bible story concludes that when everyone showed compassion, there were 12 baskets full of food left over, one for each disciple who had originally doubted. And that's one of the things we have to hold on to. We may not think we're terribly talented, that we have much to add into the mix. And God, through the Apostle Paul, made very clear that we should be using body language, the gifts and talents of everybody, the little bit we're able to give here or there. The resources we have may seem small, but when combined together, like Lucy's fist, become a powerful instrument. And so as you think about Operation Christmas Box, those small little gifts you might get from a dollar store may be used in very special ways because the missionaries who are distributing them have an opportunity to say that this has been done by Christians who care about you. It may not seem like much, but we have a God, we have a Savior who cares about you, and He wants you to follow Him. It is amazing as we listen to missionaries throughout the world, especially those of us who have listened to the Thornblooms or the X-Strands about what has happened in Congo. It's amazing how a little bit of effort has made a huge impact. And as we have collected our small bits of money for Congo kids, suddenly we discover that whole villages have been given supplies of water because wells have been dug. And so God says, never underestimate what I can do with what you can get.